you fighting orphans of the Pacific? How strict? This is after her weekend, Annie, back on the air strictly under UN hours. Reception okay? Well, it better be, because this is all request night. And I've got a pretty nice program for my favorite little family, the wandering boneheads of the Pacific Islands. The first request is made by none other than the boss. And guess what? He wants Bonnie Baker, and my resistance is low. Now, what taste you have, sir, she said.
The subtle art of propaganda directed against one's enemies has been part of war since ancient times. However, its potential for mass psychological impact created a new paradigm with the invention of modern electronic communications. Every nation involved in the Second World War, whether it was Allies or Axis, employed agencies devoted to the mission of demoralizing and misleading the enemy. In America, Frank Capra, director of beloved films such as It's a Wonderful Life and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, also directed wartime films demonizing the Germanic personality, including a training film that warns young GIs that German women do not share a natural capacity for human ethics common to higher civilizations and therefore must be avoided. Theodore Giselle, beloved to Western children as Dr. Seuss, wrote stories that stereotyped, demeaned, and demonized the Japanese, complete with insulting and offensive illustrations. Radio Free Europe filled the airwaves with pro-Western speech as a counter to communist expansion and diatribes about the otherness of enemy societies. The Japanese were no different and had chosen the enticing and alluring appeal of the female voice to disseminate their propaganda throughout the Pacific region and as far as the U.S., and although there were many female broadcasters involved, they collectively gave rise to the legendary Tokyo Rose. During World War II, Tokyo Rose was not any one individual, but rather a group of largely unassociated English-speaking female radio broadcasters of propaganda throughout the Japanese Empire. The programs were broadcast in the South Pacific and North America to demoralize Allied forces abroad and their families at home by emphasizing troops' wartime difficulties and military losses. In the years after the war, the character Tokyo Rose became an important symbol of Japanese villainy for the United States. American cartoons, movies, and propaganda videos between 1945 and 1960 tend to portray her as sexualized, manipulative, and deadly to American interests in the South Pacific. Similar accusations concern the propaganda broadcasts of Lord Haha and Axis Sally. In 1949, the San Francisco Chronicle described Tokyo Rose as the Mata Hari of radio. Later, the name Tokyo Rose would become attached to Iva Toguri, and she would spend much of her life after the war trying to clear her name. Born on July 4, 1916, to Japanese immigrants who ran an import business in Los Angeles, she was a member of the Girl Scouts, played on her school's tennis team, and eventually graduated from UCLA with a degree in zoology. In 1941, her parents sent her to Japan to care for an aunt in poor health. It was the first time the 25-year-old Toguri had ever been overseas, and she soon became homesick. However, in December, her situation took a dramatic turn when a problem with her paperwork prevented her from taking a ship home. A few days later, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Trapped in Japan, the authorities tried to get her to renounce her U.S. citizenship and swear her allegiance to Japan. She refused, unlike many other Americans in Japan at the time. She was then classified as an enemy alien and kept under close observation. After several months of harassment, she moved to Tokyo and took a secretarial job as a typist at Radio Tokyo. While there, she met Major Charles Cousins. Cousins was an officer in the Australian military who had been captured by the Japanese. Having been a successful radio announcer before the war, he was conscripted to produce the 0 Hour propaganda show. He and other POWs working on the show defied the Japanese by making the show as harmless as possible. Cousins had the idea that Toguri would be perfect as a radio announcer. Toguri's voice was rough and masculine, the opposite of the sultry, seductive voice typically used in propaganda. Starting in November of 1943, Toguri became a recurring feature on 0 Hour. She took on the name Orphan Anne and read the scripts from Cousins in a joking manner, occasionally warning the listeners that the show was propaganda. American servicemen gathered around radios to listen to 0 Hour, a program produced by the Japanese to serve propaganda to the American troops. GIs saw the show as a welcome distraction from their duties and developed a fascination with the husky-voiced female host and her taunts and jokes set between pop records. In one broadcast in 1944, she started with, "Greetings, everybody. This is your little playmate, your bitter enemy, Anne, with a program of dangerous and wicked propaganda for my victims in Australia and the South Pacific. Stand by, you unlucky creatures, here I go." According to studies conducted during 1968, of the 94 men who were interviewed and who recalled listening to the 0 Hour while serving in the Pacific, 89% recognized it as propaganda, and less than 10% felt demoralized by it. 84% of the men listened because the program had good entertainment, and one GI remarked, "Lots of us thought she was on our side all along." Toguri performed her Orphan Anne character on the 0 Hour for roughly a year and a half, but she appeared with less frequency in the lead-up to the Japanese surrender in August 1945. By then, she had married Portuguese-Japanese man named Felipe d'Aquino and was looking to return home. She remained in dire financial straits, however, so when 2 American reporters arrived in Japan and offered $2,000 for an interview with the famous Tokyo Rose, she naively stepped forward to recount her story. It would prove to be a disastrous decision. Once her identity became public, Toguri was made into the poster child for Japan's wartime propaganda and was arrested on suspicion of treason. After World War II ended in 1945, the U.S. military detained Toguri for a year before releasing her due to a lack of evidence. Department of Justice officials agreed that her broadcasts were innocuous. But when Toguri tried to return to the United States, an uproar ensued because of Walter Winchell, a powerful broadcast personality, and the American Legion lobbied relentlessly for a trial, prompting the FBI to renew its investigation of Toguri's wartime activities. She was convicted of treason, her citizenship was removed, she was fined $10,000, and she was sentenced to 10 years in jail. It was nearly 2 decades before there was a fresh development in her case. In 1976, 2 of the key witnesses from her trial admitted they had been threatened and goaded into testifying against her. "She got a raw deal," one of them said. "She was railroaded into jail." Around that same time, the foreman of her jury said that the judge in the case had pressed for a guilty verdict. With public opinion turning in Toguri's favor, groups ranging from the California legislature to the Japanese American Citizens League all endorsed a new petition for a presidential pardon. On January 19, 1977, in one of his last acts in office, President Gerald Ford granted the request. Toguri, who was then 60 years old, was exonerated of treason and her American citizenship was restored. "It is hard to believe," she said at the time, "but I have always maintained my innocence. This pardon is a measure of vindication." The woman once known as Tokyo Rose later returned to private life in Chicago, where she died in 2006. The story of Tokyo Rose has become legend, an English-speaking Japanese woman who caught the ears of GIs in the South Pacific over the airwaves with her uniquely rough and almost masculine voice, and popular American music mixed with reports of Japanese success and Allied failures, and encouragement to give up the fight. But the truth is, there was never a Tokyo Rose. The name was just a term used by GIs to refer to a variety of female Japanese broadcasters. However, that didn't stop one American woman, Iva Toguri d'Aquino, from being convicted of treason following the war for being the infectious Tokyo Rose. The legend of Tokyo Rose remains alive today as a testament to the power of a woman's voice on the airwaves, a power that can be heard through the voices of prominent female broadcasters on radio stations around the world. Iva Toguri d'Aquino and the many other female propaganda broadcasters of her time serve as another example of people who have suffered the pain of progress.
I have a dream today. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
To go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.